It's a great pleasure to speak in this forum at the interface of philosophy and translation, where I've worked for around 2 decades under the light of the therapeutic reading of Wittgenstein's later philosophy and having post-structuralist, hermeneutical and descriptive approach in translation studies, TS, as a background. I usually talk to people at either side of the interface, not counting on shared knowledge to develop an argument. This virtual meeting is an extraordinary occasion, and I hoped there will be some follow-up. I'm not good in reading a paper, but I have to read in order to keep the time. I count on your understanding in the case of minor reading aloud problems. My point here is that transcendental arguments apply to the case of translation theory. No matter what concepts of translation we rely on, a basic tenet is that translation occurs through language, its effect of language use. The inner relation of conception of language and translation theory is not a new topic in TS. One problem I see in the ongoing discussions regards coherence. Even if one sees the connections, the logical implications aren't always taken into full account, as in the case of Kopetsky and Wetzel. There is need for more attention to the nature of this relation. My epistemology of translating poses that conception of language and translation theory aren't at the same level, the first being logically prior to the later. As to TS, I'd like to highlight 3 authors. Maria Timosco took up Wittgenstein's concept of family resemblance in coining the term translation for enlarging the field and empowering translators. I propose a further enlargement to cover also metaphorical uses in neighboring disciplines at a very basic theoretical level. Philip Wilson showed that also other concepts of the later Wittgenstein can be useful in TS, supplying concrete fields of application for them. Both authors refer to Gideon Turry as one of the first scholars to talk of Wittgenstein in TS. And I shall explore a point in Turry's stance that might help us to come further together. Timosco and Wilson bring philosophical concepts to TS. My approach goes the other way around, suggesting a move towards philosophy, to let go some pretensions of scientificity in TS. The 2 perspectives aren't mutually exclusive, but have some incompatibilities. I don't like Timosco's use of cluster concept as a synonym of family resemblances, because cluster concept evokes cognitive sciences. No matter if Timosco herself perceives this assimilation as problematic. The later Wittgenstein wouldn't speak of necessary and sufficient conditions for pertaining to a category, especially of the empirical world. His discussion is conceptual and has to do with openness and fluidity. Family resemblance is itself the result of a perspicuous representation, a way of establishing intermediary links via analogical procedures, using objects of comparison. It relies upon an idea of language as use that ties together Wittgenstein's latest concepts, as those revisited by Wilson. If we dissociate family resemblance from this conception of language and use it on the basis of other premises, the concept loses rigor. It becomes something else. Chimosko doesn't recall Wittgenstein's later conception of language in her discussion of meaning. She refers to Quine and Derrida, who have anti-essentialist, post-positivist stances, but understand and talk about language functioning in a different way than the later Wittgenstein. This might not matter much for a project of empowering translators, but it does matter for a philosophical discussion. Wilson suggests one could recur to Chomsky or Wittgenstein depending on the task. I understand this isn't the case, for their conceptions of language are incompatible. Furthermore, conception of language is something that lies very deep and cannot be changed at pleasure, as one changes clothes according to the occasion. A conception of language pertains to the grammatical. It organizes the way we see things. We cannot imagine black being lighter than white, nor a body without extension, a surface without properties as color and shape, etc. Grammatical stances lie so deep that we have to change everything if we change them. Wittgenstein speaks here of the images we build up with our concepts, a way of looking at things. Such images are necessary and have a constitutive role in our approach to the world, but they might also lead us astray. Doing the therapy of dogmatic pictures, concepts taken too far, the one-sided diet, is the task of the grammatical description of how concepts are actually used. Stating that the change of a grammatical stance has implications for the whole we construct does not amount to a dogmatic position. It just recognizes the pertinence of the transcendental argument, here applied to conception of language itself. The place to look at for understanding the changes in Wittgenstein's philosophy is conception of language, which is deeply essentialist in the Tractatus and radically anti-essentialist in the later writings. Wilson discards Wittgenstein's early work as not relevant for current TS, but it doesn't focus on conception of language. And this might be the reason he refers to Weber's discussion of Wittgenstein's translation concepts when talking about the importance of context. Weber, however, approached the topic using the old essentialist conception of language from the Tractatus, at odds with the concepts of the later philosophy that Wilson shows to be useful in clarifying in TS. Translation theories can be made compatible at the very degree they are commensurable at their basis. The way they describe or try to explain language use. The problem is that we tend not to look at what is at the very base of our assumptions, what we take for granted. This is why we should ask on what basis a translation theory is posed, and also if its underlying conception of language allows for an adequate description of the actual, might be ad hoc language use, Anwendung, Verwendung, and or the consolidated language usage, Gebrauch. Brazilian philosopher Ale Moreno speaks of the transcendental function of signs and concepts, to be described only a parte post, Granger. This thought applies to theorist translation norms. Kant places his a posteriori in the empirical, analytical domain. Granger's a parte post means that the description is only possible after the fact. But the transcendental function, Moreno, was at work already during the act. Timosco speaks of the a posteriori nature of translation research, and that applies to empirical data. A better understanding of the grammatical and its transcendental function would be a gain of a more philosophical approach. Transcendental arguments claim that X is a necessary condition for the possibility of Y, and that if Y obtains, then X must too. Accordingly, one can infer the conception of language at the basis of any theory of translation by looking at how this theory applies to different concrete cases. The qualities one ascribes to language are conditions of possibility for translation. This is the case of theorist understanding of translation as a concept organized by family resemblance. Theorist's adequacy vector is of analogical nature. One can here speak of similarity, but not of equalness. As in the case of Wittgenstein's analogical relations, similarity isn't necessarily given. It relies on perception of aspects and depends on our disposition to see something as similar to something else. Chris Betzel departs from the notion that perception is action and suggests that language game follows after instinctive reaction, leading then to family resemblances. So, everything of similarity is an aspect same. Thus, theory's adequacy vector relies on aspect same and the mobilization of the will. Wittgenstein's notion of family resemblance shows the fecundity and productivity of the vagueness that Steccone sees in similarity as a fundament of translation. Wittgenstein showed that many concepts of natural language are intrinsically vague. Circa, field of vision, psychological concepts like memory and expectation, etc. The same applies to translation. Without vagueness, the concept cannot be rigorous. Wittgenstein also argued that vagueness exceeds exactitude, whose limits are established within our different language games. Timosco took up this aspect in her discussion of family resemblance and advised against generalizing what happens in one kind of translation to others. We can give this insight a more radical reading at the epistemic or grammatical level, recognizing that here vagueness precedes exactitude in a constitutive way, so that any rigorous use of the concept translation has to take this into account. It's vagueness what makes the analogical relation between source and target text possible. Thus, vagueness is a condition of possibility for translation. This applies also to metaphorical uses in neighboring disciplines, enabling the construction of intermediary links at the base of a larger family, not restricted to TS proper. For the use of Wittgensteinian concepts in TS, an obvious insight is to see translation as a language game. which is different than speech act as understood by Olsen and so on. Wittgenstein's examples go far beyond what counts as a typical speech act, as giving orders and acting on them. Taking this into account, translating from one language into another is not only a simple language game like giving orders. On the contrary, it is a complex language game that entails many moves, as in other examples of Wittgenstein's list, like solving a problem in applied arithmetic, forming and testing hypotheses, etc. Translation, however, can also be read as a simple or partial language game embedded in complex ones. In such cases, we might speak of translation as a move in such complex language games, as in the building of an argument, the construction of social narratives, etc. Thus, the use of the concept translation in philosophy can amount to very different moves, depending on the premises and the goals at play. It isn't hard to perceive that philosophical traditions rely on very different bedrock assumptions. So, the concept translation assumes very different roles in the building of a philosophical reasoning, according to the tradition it's embedded in. This is not the place, and I'm not the best person to tackle the more technical aspects of such a discussion. So the hint at a couple of examples should suffice us for now. Compare, for instance, how Heidegger, Quine, Locke, Rigor, and Ottaviano and Feitosa deal with the topic. We could even tell Moreno's definition as asterisk meaning, pointing at how family resemblance derives from meaning as use. Accordingly, we shouldn't expect that what is true for one application must apply to the others as well. Timosco, too, advises against such generalizations. I propose we should also look carefully at the conception of language underlying the respective use of concepts. If, as Wittgenstein poses, recognizing what is at the basis of our thoughts is the most difficult task, reflection will be effective only if one goes deep enough. That's where the transcendental argument comes into play. That's why we should value the constitutive vagueness of translation as a condition of possibility. I thank you for your attention and look forward to our discussion.